It saves our relationships from being superficial. It prevents us from being merely functional in life. If you can kind of get the feel of this, really, if you're living in the introvert part of who you are, where that capacity to feel and to gain insights and to reflect resides, it means that the connection with life and with another human being has the ability to go so much deeper.
Thank you for pressing play on the Grow Your Dreams podcast. Just like plants need water and sunlight to grow, I think in the same way, we need encouragement and inspiration on our own journeys of growth. Stay connected with me on Instagram over at Grow Your Dreams podcast, and also check out shaylinfair.com for show notes and more inspiration. Welcome back, John. It's so good to have you here again.
Thank you, Shaylin. It's lovely to be here. Looking forward to it.
Yes, I'm excited about this episode because we're going to be diving deep into understanding what it means to live from the introvert rather than living just in your extrovert temperament. And to kick off, can you just give us a brief description what the introvert and extrovert is for a new listener?
Certainly. Well, one of the things that it's worth saying is that we all have an introvert. Not all of us have an extrovert, but that tells me that the introvert is indispensable. And it's that part of us that feels things perhaps most keenly, has the capacity to pick up reality, perhaps in a way that the extrovert doesn't automatically do. It's the part of us that is reflective, the capacity to feel things deeply, the need to process things within the introvert is therefore really important. It's like the engine room, the part that drives us, and that's why each of us has one. There's at least two parts to each of us. We call them our temperaments. We've talked about them as two people living in one house, but there's always an introvert. And that's what we're going to be considering today. How much do we really live there? How much space do we give to the introvert in our lives? Or do we tend to live predominantly in the extrovert? Do we use the extrovert even as a substitute or a defense from the introvert?
So you mentioned that the introvert is the engine room and where the processing of emotions, I guess, happens.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So where does it go wrong then with people? Well, the question is, where does it go wrong and why does it go wrong where people don't engage with the introvert part of them?
Okay. I think two things, nature and nurture. I think that part of us can feel, for the phlegmatic temperament, very unsubstantial. I think for the melancholic temperament, it's very easy for that person to be negative against themselves. That's there by nature. So their natural tendencies to be negative about themselves. So that's not a very good starting point, but that's just the way it is. And then because of that, it kind of sets up a bit of a vicious circle. So nurture comes in. If we don't have an environment in which somebody knows how to connect with us, obviously, ideally, it would be a parent, preferably both parents. If they are able to connect with us in our introvert, then we will be secure enough to allow ourselves to feel what we feel as an introvert, express it, and to have that validated. But if our parents and perhaps siblings don't know how to live at that level, then that's a place we learn not to go. The problem is, as we said right at the beginning, because that's the place where we experience the depth of emotions and realities of life, that's exactly where the emotions need to be processed. So it quite quickly takes on quite strong negative connotations, and we just learn to avoid it.
And in avoiding, do you mean, is it like suppressing and pushing down those emotions or the feelings about situations?
Yes, yes,
Is that what you mean, like practically? Like, and why make that move?
yes, yes. I think that why is very important. I'll just run through one or two quick answers to that. We need to live in the introvert because the introvert is able to somehow pick up reality more readily than the extrovert. It's just the way it's designed, it's what it's there for. But the introvert is capable, if we're not protecting it and not avoiding it, of picking up everything. And if we were to use that positively, it puts us in a very strong position in our decision making, in our wisdom, our insight into certain situations. It also gives us depth. It saves our relationships from being superficial. It prevents us from being merely functional in life. If you can kind of get the feel of this, really, if you're living in the introvert part of who you are, where that capacity to feel and to gain insights and to reflect resides, it means that the connection with life and with another human being has the ability to go so much deeper. And we all know the difference, don't we, between a relationship that is purely functional, in which we're communicating possibly ideas and facts. I did this today, I went there and saw that person. The difference between that and a communication that actually says, but this is what I felt when I was in that situation. This is what happened to me.
And you mentioned about protecting the introvert. How do people do that? How do we go about doing that when we're trying to protect that introvert part of ourselves and then we're not connecting at a depth?
Well, I think what happens is the extrovert steps up and looks at what's happening to the introvert and says, leave this to me, and protects and substitutes. So, for example, and I use an illustration of thinking of our two temperaments when we were young, perhaps on our first day at school. Off they go. The extrovert, when you face the school bully or the challenging situation, the extrovert will step in and will either try and blag their way through it or thump somebody on the nose or whatever. But the introvert, where all the emotions are going on, is probably terrified and is hiding behind the extrovert. So you've heard from some of the previous podcasts, if we have an understanding of the temperaments, the choleric extrovert will step up and use his or her mind to argue and debate and rationalize. The sanguine may resort to a physical response, but all the time it is a substitute for actually engaging with the introvert. And that's perfectly understandable if the child is in a family situation where he or she can go home, talk about their day at school at that introvert level, then there is no reason to stay hidden. But if there is not that ability, what do you do with all the feelings that have gone on in there? So you do just avoid it.
Do you have an example maybe from your life or just an illustration of maybe what that protecting of the introvert looks like maybe in a marriage or in an adult like relationship? In
Yes.
a scenario?
Yeah. Well, one does come to mind in my own situation, actually. Probably just a few years into marriage, a situation arose where some people treated us. No, it wasn't they treated us badly. It was something that happened that was quite hurtful. And I remember Merle saying to me, that must have been hurtful. And my initial response was, "Oh no, that's okay. We're all looking in the same direction. We'll be fine." That more extrovert answer. And then she just repeated it. She said, "No, that must have been hurtful." And I actually stopped, and I thought, yeah, actually it was. So we had a conversation at a different level. So that's a very simple, practical one, but there is a choice to be made as to where we live, which is obviously what this podcast is about, the importance of being able to go into the introvert and to live from that place.
And can you maybe flesh out then what would it look like and what are the benefits of going to that place and living from the introvert?
Okay. Well, what comes into my mind is, without giving you a list of benefits at the moment, is I end up talking to a lot of people who are suffering the consequences of not going there. So there are things that have happened in their lives, sometimes big things, painful things, sometimes as a result of somebody else's choices, and sometimes their own choices. And the extent to which they're not looking at the seriousness of those choices and the impact that they've had on them and possibly on others, to that extent, they're actually in a muddle. And somewhere that muddle comes out, and it can come out in a physical condition, can come out as ME or CFS, but it can. That's not the only way. There is always a price to pay to the extent that we don't live in reality and we don't process reality. It catches up. It's a bit like having a smouldering fire beneath the floorboards. That can go on for a while, but if it's giving off toxic fumes, it begins to affect the health of the people in the house, and they become sick, and they don't really know why they're sick. But if the proper investigation was done under the floorboards, they might find that piece of wire that is smouldering or something that is happening that is affecting the whole atmosphere. And eventually it catches up. You can get away with it for years. You can develop a lifestyle, but there will always be a price to pay. And that's why we encourage people to choose to go into the introvert.
So this is where I need some more understanding. Is to go to the introvert is painful because if the reality of a situation is painful,
Yes.
even being a Christian, we think, okay, just look forward, move forward, don't look back. The past is the past.
Yes.
So I guess as a Christian, how do you kind of close that gap between having to look at painful emotions and processing them, but then also not getting stuck there? Or
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a good question. It's a good question. Thing is, we should be taught, and this isn't about me blaming parents because I'm not really into that, but it is just looking at the facts. If we're not taught as a young child how to process the difficulties of life, the disappointments, the frustrations, the fact that things don't always work out the way that we want them to. If we're not taught almost step by step, perhaps even daily, how to handle that stuff, we learn not to look, and that becomes our way of handling it. And then we find that we haven't got the tools to handle it. So the idea of looking at something extremely painful is not appealing. Not so much because it's painful, but because it feels like it will overwhelm us. We haven't got a context to put it in. It feels too big because we never learned as we were growing up, perhaps through no fault of our own, how to sort of handle and develop our ability to handle the pain of life incrementally. So as an adult, this stuff hits us, sometimes feels like out of the blue, but we're just not equipped. And sometimes I'll sit with a married couple, and I feel, and they're at loggerheads, but I feel really sorry for them, and we'll say to them, nobody gave you the tools as to what to do with the emotions that you are trying to handle in this high stakes situation. And you almost have to sort of break it all down, start at the bottom and work your way up. But it's about knowing that you're safe in order to handle powerful emotions, some of which have been repressed, built up like a pressure cooker for many years. So that's another factor. You're not just dealing with the present situation. You're dealing with what I call the residual emotions, often from situations that sometimes produced an identical set of emotions that
Yes.
now combine with a present emotion or situation and become a tsunami. And nobody's going to voluntarily go there. Lots of people don't go there until they're forced to, either with some kind of breakdown or physical condition that is sometimes the result of sheer emotional pressure.
So you mentioned about having the tools and
Yes.
feeling safe. So we can go into our introvert when we feel safe to. How do you start to feel safe?
Okay. That's a good question. So we could say, well, how do we make the move? So if we perhaps create a scenario in our minds of, here we are, perhaps as a result of this podcast, you think to yourself, okay, there is a case here for living in my introvert. It may not be particularly appealing. It may just be a concept at the moment, but there are many advantages to it. How do we actually do it? So let me break this down. I think the first thing we need to do is recognize the need for change. That sounds a very obvious thing to say, but I think recognizing that there is a different way of living, a whole different way of living, is a key. So if we go back to that simple illustration where we've said two people in one house, those two people represent your two temperaments. The house is you. So the attitude of your extrovert to your introvert is the key here. And what we've seen is that in a person's life, it will be very easy for the introvert to be sidelined and for the extrovert to have a negative attitude towards the introvert. And it's interesting that that means we will question the value of the introvert, and we'll question its ability to function properly. So we've got really negative doubts about the value of the introvert, and that's what needs to change. I don't know if this helps, but imagine the compere at, say, the Royal Variety Performance. It's his job to crack the jokes and link the acts together and connect with the audience, but the largest part of his role is to introduce the stars of the show. So he does a big build up, he steps back, the curtain opens, and then all eyes are focused on the stars of the show, and they do their stuff. Now think of the extrovert as like the compere and the introvert as the stars of the show. Now, if that extrovert does not have a changed attitude towards his introvert, he's not going to let the introvert be the star. The extrovert has been used to running the show and he's been used to being the star of the show. And now he's got to change his attitude towards his introvert. It will feel really difficult because of all
Let me just come in there with, you say change the attitude. So what does a healthy attitude look like?
Okay. a recognition, as we said right at the beginning, of the incredible value of the introvert. That's the place that gives us depth, puts us most in touch with reality, gives us meaningful relationships, gives us wisdom and insight. It is an incredible partner. And another very simple analogy that is worth using. Imagine you secured a new job and you discovered that your department in that particular company was very small. In fact, there are just two of you. And the other person, you soon find out in the company canteen that he's not really particularly liked. And people moan about him being difficult and all the rest of it. And you've got to work with this guy. So it's just you and him. And to start with, you can see why people have moaned about him. He doesn't seem to be that interested in getting on with people. But gradually, over time, because you've got to work with him, you think, well, I've got to make this happen. So you do begin to listen to him. And it gradually dawns on you, this guy's talking a lot of sense. And when you do turn to him and say, well, what do you think about this? And how do you think we should do this particular project? He really has got some important stuff to say. And over time, your attitude changes towards him. You realize this fella has actually been largely misunderstood. He's different, but he's different in a really good and positive way. And I think it's that starting with, there is something within me called the introvert, and it can be either the melancholic or the phlegmatic, that has incredible value, is totally vital to me living healthily and comfortably, my relationships being meaningful, and to life really working, and to being at peace within myself. Because it's worth saying that if the extrovert has a negative attitude towards the introvert, there is an internal civil war which actually dissipates energy and stops us from living properly and comfortably in both our temperaments. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question.
I think you did. There was just so much in there that I think I was processing as you were going on.
Yes.
I think what I was trying to also grab hold of was a question that came into my mind is, how do you personally live from your introvert? Like, what does that look like for you or feel like?
Okay, and that's a personal question, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's fine. How does it work in practice? It's a funny thing to say, but I actually feel truth. I don't necessarily just see truth mentally. So if I'm talking with somebody, that conversation, let's say somebody's come for help, I see that conversation as a journey, but I'm kind of feeling my way through that journey. I do not have a kind of mental structure, some kind of technique that I tick the boxes on. I'd endeavour to start where the other person is at, and I will feel my way forward. I believe the Lord is involved in that process. I believe the Lord works in my emotions, but I do know that my introvert is available to the Lord. So I can feel things very strongly that are me actually picking up reality. I think it would be very difficult to do what I do and to be effective if I was reliant totally on mental processes, which is where, the extrovert would give you a greater emphasis on that. And I'm certainly not saying that's all there is to the extrovert. That would be wrong. But it's where the emphasis is. I remember a situation where I sat in somebody's front room. It was right at the other end of the the country a long way away from here. And somebody was hoping that a certain relationship would work out. And as I sat at that table, I knew without a shadow of doubt that it wouldn't. And I had to say so at an appropriate point and hopefully in a sensitive way. But it was important to say so because I just felt it so strongly, and it altered the whole direction of the way that I was helping this person. There was somebody else with me at the time, and they didn't really like the fact that I'd said what I said. And they tried to mitigate it and to soften it and to, oh, well, perhaps this and perhaps that. And I just knew there was absolutely no point, any discussion on it. That was the way it was. I could just feel it so deeply. And
could you feel it because of the facts you were getting about that relationship?
No. I would say that's a good example of where it wasn't just the extrovert doing an intellectual calculation. No, that was, I would say that was the Spirit of God, but within my introvert. So I literally felt the truth. And sadly, in one way, it was a good thing that what I'd felt did come true, because that would have caused more chaos if this person had had their way in a particular situation. But I would not want to do this kind of work if I was just reliant on calculating everything out or a particular technique or anything like that.
So bringing in Christianity and having a walk with the Lord, so you're saying he works in the introvert and he can also work in our emotions, because, I don't know, I've seemed to have this understanding that emotions aren't always good and you can't rely on them and they can't really be trusted.
Yes, which probably says something about what you think about your introvert.
Yeah.
But in fairness to you, having said that, I do understand why you would say that. Well, emotions are wonderful servants, but terrible masters. And Jesus has to be Lord of our lives by his Spirit. And if he is, then he takes us through processes where we learn the difference between our own emotional responses and the impulses of his Spirit. So our emotions become subject to the Lord and then available to the Lord. So it's not relying just on an emotional response. It is a consciousness of the Spirit of God working through those emotions. So you are right in that this is not about just following your emotions. You need to know this is God in my emotions, using the emotions to feel the truth.
I'm processing that. That's, yes. So are all when you talk about the introvert, you're talking about where all the emotions are processed and then how we are expressing those to others and how we truly feel about things.
Yes.
Is it the inner man, like the Bible maybe refers to the inner man?
Yes, there are many expressions that the Bible uses that I would say we can quite fairly see as almost synonymous with what we're talking about here with the introvert. So it talks about the heart, it talks about the soul even, which is the inner being, as opposed to the external. It talks about being strengthened in the inner man and all those processes. So it's going right down into the core of our being.
Yes. Have you got an example about maybe the introvert and extrovert playing out in the Bible? A picture?
Well, my mind automatically goes to the Apostle Peter. I mean, as a sanguine phlegmatic, I think you see so much of the sanguine. He was a good leader. He was a man of action. He was a natural leader. He was impulsive, but at least he was there. He would engage. He was the one who said, "Lord, tell me to come and walk on the water." There were real leadership skills in that man, but he had a flaky foundation. And I think that's one of the reasons why when Jesus first met him, he said, "I'm going to nickname you Rocky," hence Peter, because he wasn't Rocky.
Wow.
He could be really flaky. As Peter himself discovered, he didn't know that he was flaky. He was going to be the one, according to his own words, that even if everybody else cleared off, he wouldn't. But it just took a young maid by the fire that night to say, "Surely you're one of his disciples." And he couldn't take the heat, and really totally devastated himself, really completely let himself down and saw his own heart. And I think that's one of the reasons why he wept bitterly. He was face to face with who he really was. Now, I find that fascinating in this sense. He'd spent 3.5 years with Jesus, along with the other disciples. He had seen the most amazing miracles. He was part of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. He'd been there on the Mount of Transfiguration, so he knew who Jesus was. He'd seen Jairus' daughter raised from the dead, seen the 5,000 being fed. If this guy if that's a theological training, he'd had the very best. But he was nowhere near ready to go out and take responsibility. And he had to face, I'm going to say, his introvert, his phlegmatic that could be so flaky, before he was ready to go and do, interestingly, the profound task that Jesus gave him, which was feed my lambs. In other words, I want you to be a pastor, Peter, not just a pioneer going out there. Yes, you will be that. You will break new ground and do amazing things. But if you haven't got a heart that can care for the shepherd's sheep, you haven't even started. And I think that's the big lesson. And that's why our introvert is totally indispensable. It's there that we feel as a phlegmatic. It's there that Peter would have felt what those sheep needed. The weakest, the most struggling, he would be able to empathize and be there as the under shepherd. And that's what we're called to. The whole of us needs converting, and it's been redeemed, but it needs to be redeemed in practice. And the introvert needs to be made available to the Lord.
Wow. So it happens then with potentially our Christian walk that sometimes, or a lot of the times, we're just serving the Lord in our extroverts. And like Peter, going out and doing all the stuff, and you could even see all the miracles and do all the things.
Yep.
But it's actually the Lord that wants to get into the inner man and build the strength there, like Peter becoming, the rock.
Yes.
And is that strength lived out then through our attitudes changing? And because I guess, it's the heart that changes, not just the outward action.
Yes. Well, let's make it practical. If you had a situation that perhaps was quite personal to you, and maybe I could say the same to, lots of good Christian people, and they want somebody to go and talk to who would really understand, wouldn't condemn them, but would kind of get what they're saying and would feel with them and for them. How many people would you find that you could go and have that kind of conversation with? How often, when God's people are together, does that sort of conversation take place at that sort of depth? How much of church operates at that kind of depth? Or how much is it in the extrovert? People need their souls cured, to use the old phrase,
Yes.
healed, if you like. Church needs to be the place where we can drop to our introvert and live there and connect there and have that deep healing that then spreads out from that depth into the lives of the people around us and the people that we meet in everyday life during the week. That we need depth. Church needs depth. And that's why this is so important, to make the move into the introvert and to live there. So it sounds like we're reducing it to a kind of simple single step. But although we're putting it in very simple terms, the move is profound and the effect is profound.
It's also about understanding and having like a new look at actually who God has made us, because there's actually a lot more depth to each of us that we're not aware
yeah.
of almost.
Yes, absolutely. You could say of somebody, oh, they're just a very superficial person. That's actually not true. It's never true. It simply means that person, for whatever reason, has not gone into their introvert. We all have that amazing capacity for depth and meaningful connection.
Even men, because
Oh yes, yes.
yeah,
I'm so
because
surprised.
you well, I think in the culture as well, and growing up, I was always made to think that men aren't emotional and they don't have the depth and it's all just logic and they can just
Yeah.
get on with things a lot easier.
Yeah, it's just to correct a little thing in there. It isn't primarily just about being emotional in the sense of a display of emotion. It is about the capacity to feel stuff really deeply, to feel reality. So a man may not wear his heart on his sleeve, but it doesn't mean that he has to prevent himself from feeling what is actually going on. A woman can really only be made to feel safe with a man who is himself in touch with his introvert. Otherwise, he will never be in touch with her introvert.
Do you find when you're working with male and female, do men find it a bit harder to engage with that side of themselves, the deeper part, or?
The only thing that could make it slightly harder work is that they would be conscious of an image of, they've got to be macho or tough and all this stuff. But in truth, I don't think, apart from perhaps that kind of mindset, in reality, it's not harder. I think it's what we choose to do in order to avoid not being in touch with what we feel. I know of ladies who clearly are capable of feeling things deeply, but choose not to live there.
Can you maybe go through some ways where how we do avoid it? So if somebody doesn't realize that they're avoiding how they truly feel, how could they recognize that?
Yeah, I think find where your mind goes to. I remember talking to this lady, and I knew I'd sort of touched a bit of a raw nerve, and you could see her mind went to something very practical. Oh, I must go and do so and so. And I said, actually, no, you don't need to go and do so and so. Just let it register what I've said. So some, depending on which extrovert they've got, will deliberately switch into functional mode as a means of avoiding. Some will just have little phrases. Oh, well, that's life, isn't it? And, that's just the way it is, isn't it? And, they'll draw a conversation to a close. Some will even pick up their mobile and fiddle about on it. There are all sorts of ways, and there's plenty of opportunity in our society today, isn't there, for multitudes of distractions that can keep us
Yes.
busy. Whereas to stop and to face the reality, really, of what we're feeling inside and to feel safe enough to do that, that's the need that we have today.
I know I did ask this earlier again. To feel safe enough,
Yes.
how do you create that
Okay.
safety to
Okay.
face the hard feelings?
Okay. Let me paint a bit of a picture here that's part of the answer to this question of how do we make the move. We've said we recognize the need for change. We've also acknowledged that our view of ourselves as an introvert will almost certainly be the wrong one. In other words, negatively inaccurate. And what God has done is given us this amazing person, if you like, the introvert, that is just full of quality. But I think there's a place for seeing it as a parallel to all our relationships. So, what I mean by that is this: we can think here either of a friend getting to know a friend, or indeed a husband getting to know a wife, or a parent getting to know a child. So, how does that process take place? Because what I'm going to say here is the principles that are involved in building a good relationship actually are exactly the same principles that need to take place between your extrovert and your introvert, and obviously mine. It's true for all of us. So, what you do is you start with the other person. And what I mean by that is, I don't know about other people, but I think until I got married, I probably, I'm not sure I particularly thought about this, but I assumed that most people were some kind of variation on who I am. So, a different way maybe of looking at things, but still based on a kind of template, which was my way of looking at things. It didn't occur to me that there might be completely different creatures out there that think and feel completely differently and would respond to a situation completely differently. So getting married was quite a surprise on that one, but a good surprise in a way. And I think it's like that. If your extrovert looks at your introvert and tries to comprehend it through its own perspective, its own glasses, it will impose onto the introvert ingredients that are within the extrovert, and it just becomes another version. Whereas if you say, okay, it's a completely different person. So let's say you've got a man and a woman, and this doesn't happen like this, but let's say the man is 100% choleric and the woman's 100% melancholic, and they're trying to have a conversation. There's no way that choleric will get his head around who the melancholic woman is. What he has to do is say, forget this, I'm going to wipe the slate clean and start with this melancholic person, and is in fact going to say something like, talk to me. Tell me what you feel when this happens. What did you feel when that happened? What did that comment by that other person, what does that make you feel? It wouldn't make me feel anything. I'd just be water off a duck's back. But it's obviously really messed you up. Now, come on, what does that feel like? Instead of me getting annoyed with the fact that it's got into your system and has really troubled you and you keep going on about it and can't get it out of your system, instead of me getting frustrated with that as a choleric, okay, maybe I need to say I've got a completely different creature here. Let me let that person be who they are. And when you do that, then you begin to provide a safe place, because there's no condemnation or judgment. And you're saying, I'm letting you be you because you are as valid as I am. And in fact, as a melancholic, you may be picking up more of reality than what I am in that scenario that I've just described. So that is giving practical value. Come on, I want to hear what you're saying. I may not understand why that's affected you so much, but it clearly has. So that's my starting point.
So this is you doing it to yourself. You
Yes,
saying to
well,
your
yes,
introverts, you're welcome,
absolutely.
feel what you need to feel. You're not being judged. I'm not
Yes,
condemning you.
yes,
You're valued. I value
yes,
everything I'm feeling or
yes.
thinking.
But
Yeah.
that's exactly right. But the interesting thing is that same principle applies in good relationships anyway.
Yes.
So it's across the board. But yes, I'm applying it to extrovert doing that to the introvert because
And
it is
I was just going to, oh, sorry.
go on, you carry on.
I was just a comment, just a thought of saying, but that's what God does to us.
Yes,
We can go to him with everything and he values
yes,
what's going on
absolutely.
inside of us. And then we've
Yes,
got to do that internally to ourselves and then
yes,
also give that into our relationships.
yes, yes. Because a large part of our struggle is that negative attitude of the extrovert to the introvert. And if we can take that out of the equation, that's the practical way, going back to the Royal Variety performance illustration, of creating space for the introvert to be on the stage and doing what comes naturally. See, the extrovert's failure to do that has at its root, oh, that's a waste of time, you going on about all this stuff. And anyway, you're a bit silly and you've got all these emotions. That's not how life works. Let's get on and do stuff, or let's go and have fun. And the introvert is seen negatively as a spoiler, but they've not been heard. And if we would listen, there might be some negatives in there, but actually, because they're more in touch with reality, the end result is healing and joy and being comfortable. And instead of this wretched introvert being a nuisance who always pours cold water on everything, they've actually enabled us, if we're going to work in partnership with the introvert, to avoid heartache, pitfalls, and they've made sense of life. They've enabled us to build relationships, to be wise, to operate at depth. All these things are happening, but we had to push through that initial poor attitude of, oh, I haven't got time for this. Does that kind of, the parallel, does that help?
Yes, it does. I think as well for, it's not, it's a shame that it's not really taught in church, this kind of, well, maybe not churches I've been to, this understanding of just, this deeper inner man that we all have, and to
Yes,
actually live from that place,
yes,
and
yes,
creating wholeness and healing from there, and then that coming out in our relationships.
yes, yes.
Yes, so
That's, a church, and indeed any group, is no stronger than the way that we treat the weakest person. If we can't make that connection with that person, then we're too strong and we're missing the point.
So John, I'm just trying to think of how to close this up, and a
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
You said, how do we make the move? And I'm just looking at the different questions here.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to see if there's something that we haven't touched on that we could touch on. So
Yeah.
you have a few headings.
Yeah. I've got a thought that is quite important.
Go
So
ahead.
should in the same way that we've talked about the introvert trying to build a relationship with the extrovert with the introvert, it's the same process of a developing relationship. So let's say somebody has been very busy in life and very functional. We could think of a choleric phlegmatic. And we could think of that person being very activity orientated, perhaps being very successful at work, keeping busy. But there are pressures that are building up. There are anxieties within the phlegmatic. And the phlegmatic is getting missed. It can be kind of closed down much more readily than, say, the melancholic. Now, what we're saying is we need to have a conversation, the extrovert does, with the introvert, and give the kind of space that we were just talking about to the phlegmatic to begin to say, well, I'm really scared about this, or I was really hurt by that, and to really have that in-depth conversation. But
the conversation with yourself, do you mean?
Yes. Now, that could be facilitated by somebody else, or, somebody encouraging that. And often that's what I actually end up doing. I said, but look, that happened. How did you really feel about that? You made that decision. Everything went downhill from there on. Looking back now, what do you really feel? Or when that person did that to you, have you looked at that properly? And 9 times out of 10, the people haven't. They've thought about it in the sense of they've had thoughts about what has happened to them and tried to resolve it by thinking, oh, well, this person didn't realize or whatever. But they've not even begun to get in touch with what their introvert is feeling. So to go back to the choleric phlegmatic, in that situation, I would be saying to the person, you now need to build a relationship with the phlegmatic. The choleric needs to build that relationship. In other words, learn to listen. Who is this phlegmatic? Have you got a clue who he is? So just being practical, go on the website, have a look at the write-up that we've given of a description of a phlegmatic. If anybody's attended the Understanding Yourself courses, you'll have in your notes the description of a phlegmatic. And look at the phlegmatic and say, do I recognize this person? Well, if I don't, I'm obviously not giving much space to him. What sort of things do phlegmatics like? Well, one of the things they like is nice, big, wide open spaces. And then they like to be still. If you've got a choleric sitting on top, choleric doesn't like to be still. They'll be busy somewhere doing stuff. So you've got 2 people in one house with totally different interests, but they need to get on together. So find out what the phlegmatic wants and do some of that stuff. You can't do everything at once, but make sure you create space. Make sure you get out in the big, wide outdoors. Make sure that there is the kind of stillness that a phlegmatic would appreciate and enjoy, and their own version of creativity. And you can say the same to the melancholic. What do they want to do? The times I've said, look, what kind of creative thing have you ever wanted to do? And they'll always come back with an answer. And I've said, well, why don't you take some lessons in that? Why don't you develop that? Give space. So it's the extrovert is taking the time to be introduced to and to build a relationship with and to understand and appreciate and to make space for his or her introvert. And it is as concrete as building a relationship with another person. It's as definite as that. Now, my point is this: if we can't do that with ourselves, we won't know how to do it with anybody else. And that's why our relationships are not always as good as they could be. It has to start internally. If I'm prepared to put myself through that process, then I will find that my capacity to relate to others at that kind of level will proportionately increase as I become open to that process within myself.
Is that kind of connected to that scripture that says, love others as you love yourself? It's
Yes.
about knowing
Yeah.
yourself
Yeah.
really well and having a healthy relationship with
Yeah.
yourself between the extrovert part of you and your inner man or your introvert.
Yes,
And then
absolutely.
when you are able to, when we're walking that out, that naturally flows into our outward relationships. And
Yes, it's
yeah.
exactly that. I can't expect to look into somebody's heart if I'm not prepared to look at my own. If I'm pushing part of me aside, I'm not going to be able to show acceptance to that part in somebody else, that they're introvert. And that isn't just about helping people, that's about just building good, enjoyable relationships.
We'll eventually treat others in our close relationships the way we treat ourselves internally.
That's exactly right. And that is one of the big reasons for really not seeing it as an option as to whether we go down into our introvert.
Yes. Okay, so let's wrap it up then. If you were to kind of put a bow on this whole conversation and to kind of encourage someone to go on this journey of knowing themselves at this level, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think we frustrate ourselves. I think just going back to this question of wanting to love the Lord as Christians, wanting to love those that the Lord has given us. And I think our extroverts really want to do that. But if we dislike our introvert, and probably more than what we realize, it's like the tide is pulling in two opposite directions. So we know we should be kind, and we know that we shouldn't get irritable. And we resolve not to, and it might be another area of life that you might struggle with. But every attempt that you make, you still seem to be getting dragged back to that default position. And that default position is there because of what we feel about ourselves. As you rightly said, it's our attitude towards our introvert that is spilling out on those we love the most. And that's incredibly frustrating. And that's why we kind of need to surrender that part of who we are to the Lord. But surrender is a deep acceptance of the whole of who we are, because that is how the Lord has accepted us. And then a getting to know who we are, providing space for the whole expression of who we are, because that is what removes the civil war, that is what brings peace, and that is what enables us to give ourselves wholeheartedly to the Lord and to one another.
That's beautiful. I'm so encouraged to give myself more space and room for my introvert, because it's just all these conversations I think have made me realize how much more wonderful we are than we realize.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
You're very welcome. It's been good.